Greetings to you all and Happy New Year. 2022, here we come. Today, Sunday, the 2nd of January, I was listening in the morning to the Sunday worship on BBC Radio 4. It focused on the legacy of the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, was the preacher. And in his sermon, he referred to how Tutu wept a lot. And he actually compared him to Jeremiah, one of the major prophets of the Hebrew Bible, who, according to tradition, was also the author of the Book of Lamentations. Now, I don't think there are many of you who don't know something or other about Desmond Tutu, but let me just say that he was known to his friends and close associates as the Arch. That's how he liked to be addressed. He came from Cape Town in South Africa. He died on Boxing Day 2021 at age 90 and was cremated after a very nice and moving, but rather private and humble ceremony at St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town. In 1975, quite a few years ago, he became Dean of Johannesburg, and a year later, Bishop of Lesotho, and finally, the first Black Archbishop of Cape Town in 1987. But the late Archbishop's legacy, mandate, impact did not only have to do with his ecclesial appointments. After the release of Nelson Mandela from jail and becoming the first Black president of South Africa, Mandela appointed Tutu as chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a wonderful tool that we conflict resolution practitioners know a lot about, write a lot about, talk a lot about, but it is not easy to apply. And as chair of the TRC in 1994, I remember one incident that was spoken about, and that reminded me of Justin Welby's sermon today about Jeremiah and weeping, because Desmond Tutu was sitting there listening to the testimony of some of the victims of abuse during the apartheid era in South Africa, and he was crying. He was crying so much that he didn't even follow what was being said and done, and he later acknowledged it when he said that he should cry less and listen more. He was a wonderful man with a mischievous smile and an incredible sense of humor. He also was somebody who applied, I think, very closely the concept of Ubuntu, South African concept, which basically highlights the virtues of person-to-person interrelations. And those virtues are largely compassion and humanity. He's also the one who, I think, if I'm not mistaken, created that description of South Africa as the Rainbow Nation, not to mention that he was also a Nobel laureate, having received his Nobel Prize for Peace in 1984. Now, enough of the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Arch, and a very, very sort of thin background to this great man. Let me get down to the specifics of my episode. There is an Armenian adage, an Armenian maxim that goes as follows: Kna merir, yegur sirem, which roughly translated, and it's a rough translation into English, it means go and die, and then I will love you. And it's quite human, isn't it? I mean, people that we don't particularly like or empathize with or associate with when they're alive. When they die, suddenly they become our best friends and we weep for their loss and we mourn them and we eulogize them. This happens quite often. It's intercultural. It happens everywhere. But the interesting thing about all those who wept, who cried, who were deeply impacted by the loss of this man, even at the ripe old age of 90, those weren't crocodile tears. Those weren't intercultural practices. Those were real tears of sorrow for the loss of such a great man. Now, I've heard quite a few people talk about the late Arch, some of them on television, webinars. There was a long 3-hour webinar by the Cambridge based in the UK Palestinian Studies think tank, which basically brought together so many people who were talking about their understanding of Desmond Tutu and their interaction, if any, with him, as well as what has been written in the obituaries here, there, and everywhere, in the serious press and in the tabloid press. My connection with the Arch, with Desmond Tutu, for a want of a better word, is far, far more humble, more modest, and more limited. But the first time that his name resonated, meant something in my head, was when he was made General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches in 1978. I think he served for a period of 6 or 7 years. And one of the main focuses of his mandate as General Secretary of the SACC was actually to fight apartheid. Now, I didn't listen of him and about him then, but I listened quite a bit about him later because I joined the Middle East Council of Churches myself during the time when the General Secretary was the Lebanese-born Gabriel Habib, and I had actually formed a triangular body consisting or comprising of Palestinians, South Africans, and Northern Irish to come together and discuss matters or issues of faith and conflict, a kind of practice on conflict resolution. And during this period, many of the South African participants who were part of this module talked so highly of him and talked about his efforts at combating apartheid and at trying to give the real value to South Africa. But a more direct connection with him happened as far back as 1998, which is then when the World Council of Churches, what I call the ecumenical mothership based in Geneva, held its 8th General Assembly in Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe. It was both the General Assembly as well as a celebration of the 50th birthday, the 50th anniversary of the World Council of Churches. And that happened in the early days of December 1998. And it so happened that I was one of the delegates, participants in that assembly. And at that time, the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, and I think I'm not mistaken in saying that because it's going back in memory quite a few years and much has happened since then, including the deterioration of my own little gray cells, is that Dr. Conrad Reiser was the General Secretary of the WCC. And I really respected him. I liked him, and I had direct contact with him in the context of the Middle East, North Africa, and particularly at that time, the Israel-Palestine conflict. And in this General Assembly, there were so many events happening, so many participants, so many delegates from different countries and different churches. And one of the things where I had a lot of time and a lot of effort, because it was so helpful, was this concept of the padare, which is in the Shona tradition of Zimbabwe. And it's basically what it means is that it's a meeting place for common deliberation. And that's where a lot of the conversations, a lot of the networking, a lot of the learning for me actually happened. And of course, one of the key events of the 8th Assembly, 8th General Assembly of the WCC in Harare was the big service, church service. And there he was, Desmond Tutu, coming in, not somber, self-conscious, with so many crosses weighing on his chest, with so much seriousness. No, he came in as just Desmond Tutu. He came in as somebody who was laughing, and wait for it, who was, and that was also a characteristic of his, almost dancing as he walked up the aisle toward the altar. And I thought, what a man. I love this. I love this idea, the joy that we show and we share about our faith, rather than the seriousness, the somber demeanor we have, as if we're mourning rather than celebrating our faith. And this, incidentally, is why I also like, and I'm digressing here a little bit, the Ethiopian Orthodox Divine Liturgy, because it is not so serious, stand up, sit down, stand up, sit down. No, it's a communal fellowship. It's a koinonia. It's a way of celebrating our faith. Anyway, here was this man, and it was great. I really liked it. And that's where I had my direct conversations and contact with him during this event. And of course, for those of you who have long memories, you might remember that the WCC then also, as it does these days, came up with a statement on the status of Jerusalem, which was worth reading then and is still sadly worth reading today. And of course, with Konrad Reiser, the General Secretary of the WCC, there was also, I think, the moderator, he was, of the World Council of Churches, the Armenian Catholicos Aram I of the House of Cilicia in Antelias in Lebanon, another wonderful man that I've had the pleasure of knowing and somehow calling a friend too. Now, this is the second step of this episode. The first one was a general broad brush of Desmond Tutu through the eyes of yours truly. The second one was sort of bringing it down to a narrower prism of Middle East, North Africa, ecumenism, Palestine. And now I come to the third and final setting of this episode, which is Palestine itself. Now, what I have noticed is that all the obituaries, okay, let me be careful and legal. Most of the obituaries that I have read or heard, the webinars, etc., they talk about what a wonderful man Desmond Tutu was. He was this, he was that, the TRC, the first Black Archbishop. I mean, everything that could be said about him, his forgiveness, his theology, his very, very, very nice sense of humor, but also his seriousness on issues, the fact that he supported gay people, and he said that he would not, he could not think of a God that was homophobic. All this is being said and reiterated, and I hope it will continue to be so, because my worry is that human beings being human beings, we get all excited and enthused about any particular event or person during a short period, and then once that event or person is gone, then the interest and the impact of the person or the event wane. I hope that's not going to happen with this wonderful man. But what I noticed, that in the midst of all these write-ups and TV and radio coverages, one thing was distinctly missing. It was also incidentally missing today in Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby's sermon on the Sunday worship on BBC Radio 4. And I thought to myself, here is a man who's talking about how Desmond Tutu had taught him and the world to support the dispossessed, the poor, those who are facing injustice, who are in conflict situations, etc., etc. And not one word, the word Palestine, was mentioned in the sermon. Never mind. Maybe I'm too sensitive to this issue. Maybe I'm politicizing what should not have been a political sermon, granted, but it drew my attention. Anyway, the fact remains that no matter how much we try to whitewash his legacy, the fact remains that the late Archbishop, the Arch, was a very firm supporter of the Palestinian conflict, the Palestinian cause. And he actually went so far not only to support the African resolve to stand behind Palestinians in their struggle, but he also supported the BDS campaign that Palestinians are trying, somewhat successfully, somewhat unsuccessfully, to maintain across the world in order to fight their own apartheid system in the occupied territories. He supported those sanctions, just as he supported sanctions to get rid of apartheid in South Africa earlier in the 1980s or whenever. So in a sense, this is a reality. And I wanted to mark this reality in this third setting of this short episode, because it is worth mentioning that a man of his stature, a man of his love for others, a man who lived with the concept of Ubuntu, a man who basically liked to communicate, is also a man who fought injustice ferociously, without equivocation when he saw it. I remember stories about him refusing, for instance, to share an event with one of our former prime ministers, Tony Blair, because he disapproved of Blair's policies and politics during the Iraq war. There are other stories as well. I mean, two of his famous quotes or statements, and there are so many. One I thought was brilliant, in which he said, he talked about the foot of an elephant on the tail of a mouse. And he said, when somebody comes and looks at this situation, when that huge foot of an elephant is on the tail of the mouse, and then he says, oh, well, in conflict situations, we should talk about neutrality. He said, neutrality does not help the mouse. How true that is. And somewhat more seriously, he also has been quoted as saying that if you are neutral in situations of injustice, then you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was one of the brave Christian leaders we've had, irrespective of background, denomination, church, etc. He spoke power, truth to power. He was not afraid to call a spade. And whilst many of our church leaders, again, across many churches and traditions, intimate, allude, talk, walk nimbly over injustice issues, This man never shied away from it. And he also paid the price because he was sometimes not welcome into some countries. He couldn't do things, and some people reviled him for his positions. And here we are, the man has died, almost a hagiography to be written about him. And what do? We remove the word Palestine from his achievements, from his positions, and from his life. Now, that will not happen with me. And I know there are think tanks, there are Palestinian organizations, there are other Western organizations as well, dealing with human rights abuses, etc., who will make sure that the future legacy of this man does mention and does include his unwavering support for Palestinians in their struggle against occupation, against apartheid, and for self-determination. And if I can finish, because every coin has two sides, I would also say that maybe the Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian politicians, the policymakers should also remember that in the past, one of the strengths of the Palestinian cause was that they aligned themselves with what was known then as the non-aligned movement, which included countries like South Africa. And those countries, time and again, supported Palestinian aspirations, be that in international fora such as the UN General Assembly or elsewhere. But recently, it seems to me that this support is being lost. Why? Because the Palestinians themselves have suddenly become either inactive, confused, or besotted only with one or two political addresses, the United States, a couple of others perhaps, and have forgotten all this huge bulk of support by people around the world for their cause, which perhaps do not qualify as global north, first world, or superpower. This is perhaps also a wake-up call for Palestinians today. So as I look at this man, at this image that I have, I chose this image. There were so many, but I chose this image because it shows his vulnerability, but it also shows his holiness. And this is what a prophet is all about. And if he's to be compared with Jeremiah, that's fine. But let's not forget that he also was a friend of Palestinians. May he rest in peace, and may his legacy not be washed away, but be one of the beacons that will lead some of us in our work on this, in this world, in this global village. Take care. And once again, I started, so I'll finish with the same wish. Happy New Year to you all. May it be, and I always say this, may it be a new year that is truly new, as Archbishop Patrick Kelly also said, but it's also a new year of health and hope. Put them together, you might even get happiness. Take care.